Okay, so the cells that I were mainly talking about in the last section of this module were all keratinocytes. So keratinocytes will migrate and develop and move through the epidermis from the basal layer and will transform itself as it ends up in the stratum corneum before it sloughs off the surface of the skin. But now we're going to talk about other types of cells besides keratinocytes that are also present in the epidermis. One of the cell types is called a melanocyte. So a melanocyte actually comes from neural crest cells. So a long time ago when we talked about the origin of neural crest cells, actually we haven't done that yet, so we'll do that in the next block. I'll talk to you about how neural crest cells can develop into lots of different cells of the body. And one of them, it kind of seems a little bit out of place, is the pigment cells of the epidermis. And that's what we're looking at today. And so here you can see a melanocyte, and the melanocyte does look different from its neighboring keratinocyte. So you can see it has this pale staining cytoplasm around the dark nucleus, and that looks different from the darker staining cytoplasm of the keratinocytes that are its neighbors. But they're a lot harder to find in a histologic section. So if you're having trouble finding melanocytes, don't be too concerned about it. But a melanocyte's function is to produce melanin and distribute the melanin to the surrounding keratinocytes in the epidermis. And melatonin is going to block UV radiation to actually protect the other cells from having their DNA mutated by ultraviolet radiation. So it's going to position itself around the cell's nucleus and allow for protection from the sun's UV rays. Now, one thing that's really interesting is that the melanocytes actually have a constant ratio with keratinocytes really across the human population. But it's actually the amount of breakdown that melanin goes through over its course of the keratinocytes developing further and moving through the different layers that will change the pigment of the skin. And so that's just sort of something pretty cool, is that we all have the same ratio of melanocytes to keratinocytes regardless of how pigmented your skin is. And melanocytes do not have desmosomes attaching them to their surrounding keratinocytes like the keratinocytes do. And this is because they're going to stay in the basal layer down here, and the other keratinocytes are going to move through the layers of the skin. And so they're not going to be attached to them and move out with the other keratinocytes, but rather they're going to stay here on the basal layer. But they do have hemidesmosomes connecting them to the underlying connective tissue. And they don't undergo mitosis as fast as the basal cells in the stratum basale do, so they have slow replication. But their main function is to produce melanin and distribute it to the keratinocytes to protect its nucleus and DNA. And so here you can see why maybe melanocytes come from neural crest cells, so it's derived from nerve tissue, and it's going to make melanin in a process that's a similar process to making neurotransmitters, and you'll learn this and it will be reinforced throughout your studies. And so essentially the precursor tyrosine is going to be converted to DOPA by tyrosinase, and so that's going to happen. Tyrosinase is going to be synthesized, and it's going to happen in these pre-melanosomes like you see in this cartoon drawing. And then it's going to be transformed from DOPA into melanin, and that's going to happen in these pre-melanosomes as it gets transformed into melanin. You can see in this cartoon that becomes darker, and these membrane brown structures are going to be transported to the end tips of these cytoplasmic processes that are sticking out from the cell. And so the melanocyte, although you might see on this picture, it looks like it's just like a basal cell, but what you can't see are its multiple cytoplasmic processes that stick out from the cell with melanin in it, and the surrounding keratinocytes are going to engulf that melanin. So a keratinocyte will engulf the tip of the process and take the melanin with it and part of the cell. And that is a special kind of secretion called cytokine secretion. And so here you can see an example of dark skin versus light skin, and you can see that overall the pigment in the skin is slightly different because of the distribution of melanin throughout the epidermis. And so it's the breakdown of the melanin that differs, not the production of melanin, although you can actually stimulate further production of melanin by increasing your exposure to UV rays. Okay, and so the next kind of skin cell type in the epidermis, besides the keratinocyte and the melanocyte, is a Langerhans cell. So here you can see within this special stain, this antibody stain here, you can see that these cells are actually widely distributed in the epidermis, and they kind of can be in a lot of different layers, although I think it's generally accepted that a lot of them sit in the stratum spinosum, and they also have processes that stick out from the cell body. And instead of producing melanin or producing keratin, this cell is an antigen-presenting cell of the epidermis. And so it's essentially a white blood cell that's protecting you from invaders that they come in contact with, and also antigens that they might come into contact with. And so essentially these are monocyte-derived cells, and they will gobble up the antigen, and they will present the antigen to other cells in your other white blood cells in your immune system, and it will notify your immune system that it needs to mount a response. And so you'll learn a lot more about this process when we get into the immune system, but right now it might be just helpful to realize that these cells, that's the main purpose of them, is they actually help protect the skin from antigens and invaders, and that they are derived from monocytes, and so they're essentially like macrophages that are in your skin. So macrophages can be called different names depending on where they're located at the body, and these are located in the skin. Okay, the next cell type is called a Merkel cell. Merkel cells have been described as being from both neural crest cell origin and epithelial origin. So there's information that says that they come from both. And they sit in the basal layer on the basal lamina directly, right at the interface between the epidermis and the dermis. And you can't see these cells very well in regular H&E stain. So here you can see a special stain that we're showing the cell's location. And the purpose is that they are tactile receptor cells. And they're actually very, very sensitive tactile receptor cells. So a Merkel cell is the kind of cell that will allow you to feel different textures on the surfaces of objects. So they allow you to feel Braille and read Braille, or reach into a bag and feel the surfaces of all the objects inside, and you kind of can tell by the smoothness or roughness of the surface what it is that you're touching in the bag, even if you're not looking at it. Those are the Merkel cells that are allowing you to do that. And so they have neurosecretory granules, which is another reason why there's a lot of evidence that they come from neural crest cells, and they release these granules to stimulate the afferent nerve ending that's directly nearby the cell, and it alerts your nervous system that they're being stimulated, and then it gives you information about your environment. So they are tactile receptor cells, and they're one kind. We're going to talk about other kinds of tactile receptor cells or sensory receptor cells a little bit later. Okay, we're going to answer some questions, and then we'll keep going.